What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Pro Mormon Podcast. My name's Philip, and I'm actually by myself today, so I'm not going to have anyone to really talk to, but got a lot to talk about still. So hopefully it'll still be a fun podcast for you. If you're new here, just a little background. On the Pro Mormon Podcast, we like to talk about a lot of things from the point of view of Mormons, specifically from my point of view as a millennial Mormon. And just kind of, I want to emphasize that I don't want to get into debating people. I don't want to argue about points of doctrine. I'm really here more than anything for a discussion and to start some good dialogue and to look into a lot of the things that we have in common with different people of different faiths and of different ideas and different backgrounds. And I think as we look for that common ground, we can actually really grow together and we can learn a lot, because I think we share a lot more than we think we might. So with that intro, I mean, today is I think the second day of standard time as opposed to daylight saving time, and it's kind of killing me. So hopefully I don't ramble off here too much, but I am a little bit tired. But I was just thinking, if you're like me, you're a millennial who is religious, you've probably gotten quite a bit of ridicule throughout your life, and people call you a lot of interesting names for being a religious person in this day and age. Specifically for being someone of my age group who is religious. For some reason, millennials tend to not be quite as religious as they used to. They say that they're spiritual but not religious, which is something we hear often. And we actually see people leaning a lot more towards kind of secularism, right? Or this idea of the world's teachings and scientific teachings as opposed to religious beliefs. And I understand a lot of it. A lot of people have been kind of turned off to the idea of organized religion for a lot of different reasons, some of which are justified, some not so much. But because of that lack of trust in organized religion, a lot of people have looked elsewhere for truth. If you watch my last video, I talk a lot about how truth can be found in a lot of different places, and if you get a chance, I'll link it in the description. It's a kind of a fun discussion I had with my little brother. But in that search for truth, I think we often ignore a lot of things, but we end up rushing to a different truth and abandoning a lot of things that were good. I want to talk specifically about an experience I had. So as I went through college, I'm sure as a lot of other religious millennials go through college, you're going to get confronted by a lot of teachers who don't necessarily share your beliefs. For some people, this can really shake the core of your belief system. But it was something that they always talk about. I remember I was in a Psychology 101 class, and my professor in day one said, I encourage all of you not only to be open-minded, but to be skeptical about your current belief system. And I thought that was interesting. I was also in an epidemiology class, and my professor said essentially the exact same thing, that you need to be skeptical about everything that you thought you knew, because you're going to learn a bunch of new stuff. And I think being skeptical of things that are presented to you is good. It's a good thing, because that's how we do our critical thinking, right? You question what comes in, you reason things out for yourself, and you come out with something that is a little more thought through, and usually a little bit better that way. But simply being skeptical does not necessarily mean that you're always going to end up at the same conclusion another person may, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to end up agreeing with what the professor says or whatever some scientific journal may have published. And specifically, I remember I was in an epidemiology class, right, as I mentioned a second ago. And we had a paper that we were supposed to read, really talking about how important it is to be skeptical of the information that's out there. And in this paper, it was all about how people who got the flu were more likely to become obese, right? Which I know sounds totally ridiculous, right? But it was published in an actual medical journal. And we went through and we analyzed it and all this different stuff. And there was a lot of valid points, right? I mean, the article was peer reviewed and it was published, right? So it was very valid. It talked a lot about how the flu virus can actually change the cell structure, making it hold on to fats for longer and things like that. I don't remember all the specifics, but essentially stuff like that. and really trying to prove that if you've had the flu, you're more likely to become obese, right? Which is kind of scary, especially with little kids. But when you looked a little deeper, you saw something that really made this article more interesting. And it was that the main funder for this research that was being done was a man who owned a patent on a flu vaccine, right? So you begin to start questioning things, because if a man stands to profit from this research that is being done, well, maybe his motives weren't quite as altruistic as we may have hoped. Because of that, I think it's important for us to remember, from both the religious side and the scientific side, that we need to be skeptical of what's coming in. That is true. We need to reason things out on our own, and you need to come to your own conclusions. In my last video, I talked about how important it is for the individual to be able to discern what is true, and how I believe that there is a spiritual means by which you can discern truth, that there is an absolute truth that we can find. So being skeptical will lead you to that truth. But people often think that being skeptical will essentially just turn you away from religion, and that you'll essentially accept all these new scientific things. And while I am a person, as you can tell from the way I'm talking, right, I like scientific papers, I like research, and I like analytics. Please forgive me for not necessarily believing everything that I read, being skeptical as I've been taught, right? I think it's important to know that just because there's a couple things that may contradict with something you do believe, that doesn't necessarily mean that what you do believe is 100% false, right? It means that you may just not have the full picture yet. So forgive me for not necessarily throwing away all of my beliefs, just because there was one or two articles that were published that may contradict something that I believe. Number one, how do I know, as I mentioned in that paper earlier, how do I know that the motives of that research are as altruistic as I would hope? And number two, who's to say that those findings may not change, right? I mean, I hate to be that guy, but often there are certain things that we're not 100% sure on, right? And what we find, and this is what science is supposed to do, right? We make discoveries, we make findings, and then we learn from them and progress and use those to make more findings in the future. And sometimes the findings that we make in the future may contradict what we found in the past, but it was an important step to progress. So basically what I'm saying here, I don't want to get too long-winded, I'm going to try and keep this podcast a little shorter, is that as a millennial, it's okay to still be religious. While a lot of people may be telling you that you're just a sheep, or whatever they call a sheeple, I think, that you don't think for yourself if you're a religious person or you participate in organized religion, that basically you're just being fooled. And that's not necessarily the case. I think we need to remember that the majority of people do actually think things through and actually come to these conclusions of their own free will. They weren't just never questioned it their entire life. They came to this conclusion much in the same way you did. And I think it's important to recognize that we can all take in similar information and come with separate conclusions, right? Which is why it's so important to be able to kind of figure out what is true. And that's kind of where my major belief of being able to discern truth comes from. But more than anything, I think it's something that a lot of people run into. If you're a millennial, you'll probably come across it at some point in time, that someone will give you a hard time for being religious. Oh, how can you do that nowadays? Don't you know that all organized religions are a scam? Blah, 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 that type of thing. But essentially, being skeptical is a very good thing. It leads to critical thinking. Critical thinking leads to better conclusions, and you'll become a more aware and a smarter person because of it. But just because you're skeptical and critically thinking does not necessarily mean that we will all end up at the same conclusion. And just because someone ends up at a different conclusion than you does not mean that they are not critically thinking or that they are stupid or anything like that. So I think it's important to remember that. As I mentioned at the beginning, the whole point of this podcast, I want to talk a lot about what we have in common, not necessarily what the differences are. And I think when we can treat each other that way and really embrace that core similarity that we have in our belief systems, then that's when we can kind of live better together, and I'll be happy. It's kind of what we're all here for, right? Either way, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I do appreciate it. Subscribe if you would like to kind of hear more discussions like this. In my previous video, I kind of starting off here. My previous video, I talked with my little brother. I hope to bring on a lot of other people as well to promote good discussion, and that's kind of what I'm going for here. So if you have any questions, comments, any sort of feedback, please let me know. Hit me up in the comment section, or reach out to me in any one of my forms of social media that I have linked in the description. I always appreciate the feedback. I want to make this kind of a community here, right? So, so I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to check out the other videos that we got, and I'll see you in the next podcast. So, peace out. Bye.